Back when we were kids, owning a hardware platform came with all kinds of ways of playing its games. You borrowed some from friends, you rented games when you had some spare change, and every so often you would bask in the glory of a brand new title purchased just for you. But there were all kinds of games that would come and go that you would see and hear about but not necessarily play, or at least play much of. That right there is the motivation of this very episode. We are going to take a look at some Sega CD games I don't have a ton of experience with for one reason or another, and give them a go in 2021 to see if they're any good. We have a good mix of action, sports, racing, and even a full motion video game in there for good measure. These games didn't appeal to me enough back then to warrant much attention, but maybe they have aged into something worth my time. I hope you guys enjoy Second Chance Sega CD games. Being a fan of football, I was always excited to see a new franchise pop up, and Walsh College Football was a pretty solid game on the old Genesis. Around that same time, a Sega CD version was released, and I had a bad feeling EA just dumped the cartridge on it with some full motion video and CD music. A quick inspection of the back of the box confirmed my suspicions because it looked exactly like the Genesis release. I can't say this emboldened me to give it a chance, as I had seen this kind of thing far too often on the Sega CD. Fast forward a few years later and I decided to give it a real chance to impress me. Honestly though, I'm really torn on this. At its heart, Walsh College Football is an excellent game. You can play it with up to 4 players in both co-op and competitive play, and it's loaded with a fantastic playbook and a ton of teams. It plays as well as Madden, but with the twist of using your favorite college teams. But the problem remains, this just isn't a meaningful upgrade over what you got on the Genesis. The man himself, Walsh, does offer some insights into the game and college life, but those additions are curiosities at best. When it comes right down to it, Electronic Arts didn't do much here to take any advantage of the Sega CD. That's a real shame, because I would have loved to have seen an engine that used a scaling and rotating field similar to what was done in Madden 97 on the Saturn. This just ends up being another missed opportunity to do something special the Genesis couldn't already offer.
Touchdown!
When I first saw the Sega CD was getting Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, I thought it was going to be a port of the 1993 Capcom arcade game. It was a beat-em-up similar to Final Fight that was based on a comic book series. Considering how well the port of Final Fight had gone, I was stoked to play this as well. Unfortunately, I found out that it was not a port of anything Capcom had done, and instead was a full motion video rail shooter done by Rocket Science Games, the company that had done Lodestar: The Legend of Tully Bodine for the Sega CD. Since this was released in the summer of 1994, I was well over my interest in these kinds of games and wanted no part of it. Over the years, I had seen videos on it and I'd even played it a few seconds here and there, but outside of that, I never really seriously considered investing any real time into it. Going back to it today, I must admit I didn't miss much. Things start out really promising. The storyboards and animation are absolutely brilliant, and some of the better graphics I've seen on the system. I mean, look at those screens. It was almost like watching a Saturday morning cartoon right there on your Sega CD. Things go to hell once you start playing it though. The repetition here is unreal. The same area just keeps going and going and going, and oh my god, just make it stop already. Every so often, a few new animation bits pop up here and there are a few new things to shoot at, but for the most part you are stuck in the same jungle scene for damn near the entire game. Once the scenery does change, you are stuck in the same area until the game ends. This just ends up being a bore fest quickly, despite the promising story built around it. I would have much rather have had the Capcom beat 'em up. Many of you may remember Ernest Evans from its Genesis showing in 1992. It was the sequel to El Viento and developed by Wolf Team. It was a strange game with weird animation and physics. I had been excited to play it at first because I thought it'd be something like Super Castlevania 4 thanks to its whip-based gameplay. What I didn't know at the time was that it had been released exclusively for the Mega CD in Japan in late 1991, complete with animated cutscenes and a CD soundtrack. But I hadn't cared much for the Genesis release, so I skipped out on bothering with the Mega CD version. Firing it up today, that was a damn good decision. Just getting this asshole to do anything I want him to do is a pain, and there are moments where you just want to bash the controller against the wall in frustration. He moves strange, attacks strange, and even the most mundane task can lead to absolute bewilderment. This really is a shame because the cinematics and the music are actually quite good, but getting past the gameplay to see and hear them just isn't worth it. Repeated play can make things a bit more tolerable, but only the most dedicated among you will have the patience to get that far. I am usually a fan of Wolf Team's work, but this stinker is better left buried in the back of your Sega CD shelf. In 1994, Sony released a series of sports games for the Genesis and Sega CD under their ESPN license. After playing their football game on the Sega CD, I didn't need to see any more. That game was awful, and Sony could keep its other offerings all to itself. I avoided the others like the plague over the years, and when one did crop up in my playlist, it only confirmed what I already knew. Having not spent any real time with NBA Hang Time 95, I thought for sure it was another POS I didn't want any part of. You know what though? This is actually not a bad game of basketball at all. First, this is not a port of the Midway arcade game that came out a few years later. This is a half-court 2-on-2 game that uses scaling to render the court. The effect works quite well too and sets up what can be 4-player simultaneous matches. The animation is nice and the presentation is backed up by some 90s rap and hip-hop that's actually rather pleasant. Think of this as kind of a pseudo 3D take on NBA Jam and you can picture what this offers. I must confess this was a pleasant surprise and a nice use of the Sega CD scaling technology. We didn't get to see that often, and I'll be adding this one to the old Sega CD collection after all.
Stolen. Rim shot. Yes. Yes. 2.
Not being a fan of the sport, I didn't pay Formula 1 World Championship Beyond the Limit much attention either. I mean, I played it, but it was so difficult that I just didn't want to keep going back to it. And man, nothing has changed. This game is still hard as all get out. You won't be spending much time enjoying the decent graphics because just keeping yourself on the road requires all of your concentration. After some time, I began to get a feel for the game and started to realize there is a fair bit more to this than I ever realized. There are a ton of licensed tracks, drivers, cars, and even weather effects to keep things interesting. Unlike most racing games at the time, this actually requires memorization and a heap of patience to get better at it. This is not arcade-style gameplay, and expecting to fly around the track like Super Monaco GP will yield you nothing but pain and frustration. I fired up the Japanese release out of curiosity, and it's even more difficult if you can believe it. It was released under the Heavenly Symphony name, and should be played only by the most dedicated of fans. Still, the video is decent, the scaling is tolerable, and there is a ton of content here should you appreciate attention to detail. Arcade racing fans will quickly grow tired of running off the road, but those willing to dedicate some real time to it may find a very rewarding experience. In 1994, the Sega CD got the Lawnmower Man, a port of the PC game of the same name. Unlike the versions released for the Genesis and Super Nintendo, this was an interactive full-motion video title that was sort of a sequel to the events in the movie. Cyber Job is wreaking havoc on the world and has captured Dr. Angelo and his friends in virtual reality. Here they are being systematically tortured, and it's up to you to get them out through a series of puzzles and action sequences. I never played this when it was first released, so seeing it here is just plain wild. The scenery, the nods to the movie, and the ominous soundtrack really do create one hell of a strange world. The full motion video dominates the presentation and honestly becomes the game's biggest problem. The cinematics are frequent and long, creating boredom that sets in fairly early. There just isn't enough going on to hold your interest despite the original story and its implications with the film. Had the developers at Sales Curve Interactive focused more on things to keep the player's attention instead of trying to wow us with cinematics, this could have been something to talk about. Death comes often too, so you'll be seeing the same bits of video over and over. I definitely think it's still worth playing today just for its wild visuals and music, but you likely won't be coming back for seconds. Oftentimes when you were a kid, the back of the box could make or break a video game. What you saw back there often made you either want to take it to the register and buy it, or put it back on the shelf where you found it. The latter is what happened when I saw Racing Aces on the Sega CD in 1993. It looked so plain and drab in the pictures there was just no way I was going to spend my hard-earned money on it. When I did finally play it, I only needed a few minutes to reach for the reset button so I could eject it from my system, never to be played again. For this episode, I decided it was about time I gave this a serious try to see what I could make of it. The basic concept of this is that it's combat racing with airplanes. You get weapons to shoot down your foes, and a shop to buy various repairs and upgrades to improve your chances in each race. With such a simple concept, you'd think it'd be a relatively fun game, but you'd be very wrong. The problems start with the visuals themselves. The engine is not very smooth, which directly affects the gameplay. This makes the fine movements needed for combat frustrating, and it's often difficult to stay on the exact course you want. I suppose some fun can be had if you were just gunning for the racing aspect of it, but I honestly grew real tired of this quickly. I feel this would have been immensely more enjoyable had it just been an aerial racing game that had left out the combat stuff. The gameplay just ain't good enough to support it. There was no shortage of 2D platformers in the 16-bit era. I mean, everywhere you turned there was a new one popping up. In 1994, Beam Software gave us Radical Rex, a dinosaur with an attitude, out to save his friends. I didn't give this one much thought back then. I had played the Genesis version first, and knowing how things went on the Sega CD most of the time, I just didn't need to play that version too. Playing it now, you quickly get a familiar feeling of the countless platformers of that generation. Enemies, stages, it all feels like the other games we were pelted with in the early to mid 90s. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some fun here. Rex controls well enough, and though the repetition is fierce, navigating the areas has a charm and appeal that makes taking the trip very much worth your time. Rex is animated well, as are his enemies. Sprites are large and detailed, and the soundtrack goes really well with it. Heck, I'd even say it's the best part of the entire experience. This isn't going to dethrone titles like Sonic 3, of course, but what it does offer is easily comparable to the other platformers of the time. Not the best of the bunch, but far from the worst. Back in 1994, I purchased Star Wars chess from Walden Books in Washington, D.C. I didn't know how to play chess then, but I figured it'd be easy to learn since it was tied to one of my favorite franchises. Nope, I had no clue what the hell I was doing, and it didn't take long for me to set it on the shelf, never to be touched again. Now, almost 30 years later, I am a competent chess player, and it's time to give this one another go to see what I can make of it. Before I go any further, it should be noted that this is based on the traditional game of chess as we know it, not the hologram chess game we see in the movie. You play on an 8x8 grid that is filled with pawns, a few rooks, knights, and bishops, and of course the king and queen. The theme is basically set up where it's the good guys against the bad guys of the Star Wars universe. R2-D2 represents the pawns of one side, while the stormtroopers do the same for the other. Each move that ends in conflict shows a cinematic showing that piece's demise. Sometimes you get a comical show of 3PO taking down someone, while the more serious battles can be quite violent. Nothing about the core game is compromised as far as the rules or how you play it. If this game does have a flaw, it's the near constant loading you must endure in order to see the animations. It's frequent and long and makes playing a full game a tiring affair. You can turn off these animations, and I highly recommend that you do if you want to truly enjoy what's here. It strips away the eye candy, but makes the entire thing so much more tolerable. It's always interesting to go back and play games you didn't spend a lot of time with back when they were first released. While many of them remind you why you didn't invest much time in them in the first place, some surprise the heck out of you and can be a really good time. Even though the Sega CD only has around 200 games or so, it has its fair share of these kinds of titles, particularly when it came to the stuff I looked past because there was a Genesis version of it as well. My focus was almost always on exclusive software that fit into the genres I most enjoyed. While I like to think of myself as familiar with most of the games that were released on Sega's hardware, I am often met with games I know little about or haven't played much of. That really is the joy of retro gaming in a nutshell. It's not just about the games you played to death as a kid, but also the games you missed out on. There are always games and systems to be discovered no matter how much you think you know or how far back your experience takes you. Even the old Sega Lord X here learns something new every day. I can easily do these kinds of videos for just about every console out there, so if you enjoyed it, let me know down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.